My Monomachine started freezing on me, sometimes even on boot up, but fortunately I was able to fix it by simply taking it apart and cleaning the contacts on the ribbon cables that connect the PCBs. It's an experience I'm sure is familiar to many legacy Electron owners. Due to that mild scare, I was encouraged to start sampling it again, and with this collection I focused on one-shots from the FM machines. The sample pack is free to download, no email required. Link in the description. All of the samples are recorded directly from the Monomachine and are mostly raw tones, but sometimes I also used the Monomachine filter and per track delay. In many ways, it feels silly to put the effort into curating samples of these relatively simplistic digital FM tones that aren't particularly special. Most of these sounds could be easily duplicated with Ableton's operator or other full-featured FM synthesizers. Also, I always feel most of the magic of the Monomachine isn't in the raw sound of the device, but in how you're able to work with the sounds, how you're able to modulate them, how you're able to sequence them, and how you can performatively tweak them. However, for posterity's sake, it seemed worthwhile to try and capture a bit of whatever distinctive qualities the Monomachine FM engines may or may not have. I also just wanted to have some Monomachine flavored sample fodder for the Octatrack. It was also very worthwhile to focus on the fundamentals of the FM machines, because I often get sidetracked very quickly by the multi-layered signal flow, sequencing, and modulation available on the Monomachine. I chose not to label these samples with any sorts of descriptors, which is inconvenient and obnoxious, but it encourages careful listening. The samples are loosely grouped by recording session. To begin this session, I mostly auditioned sounds while looking for something that had a rich range of frequencies, and preferably a sound that had significant development over time, which would give a wider range of results when modulating the start position. An LFO on the start position that's set to a polymetric speed value is an easy way to create longer-term variation without resorting to using a longer source pattern. In this session, I was interested in abusing digital distortion and clipping, but I tend to find the lo-fi effect to have undesirable results, so I focused mainly on using filters and compressors, which offer many opportunities for dramatically shaping frequency, dynamics, and saturation. The distortion parameter on the setup page for the filter effect is particularly interesting. I'm not sure exactly how they implemented it, but with careful listening, you will notice how it clips the audio and can substantially impact the overall gain of the signal. As always, I'm looking to use the internal triggered envelope of the filter, because it's a great way to add more movement and modulation to a sound without utilizing any precious LFOs. The Octatrack compressor is often underappreciated, but it's amazing for manipulating signals. It has tons of gain available for easy access to heavy distortion and clipping, as well as possibilities for dramatically reshaping a signal with extremely heavy-handed thresholds and ratios, combined with careful tweaks to the attack and release. With the substantial impact of the filter on the dynamics of the signal, there's a lot of interaction even with a simple filter into compressor signal chain. Re-triggering a sample fast enough to generate a distinct pitch is very much an exercise in trial and error, since the pitches produced not only depend upon the sample used, but the current tempo of the Octatrack. Here, I'm trying to generate a brief burst of pitched sound at the beginning of each trigger, but then allow the sample to play out normally after that point. I also experiment with modulation of the retrigger time. After some basic triangle modulation, I try an exponential shape triggered as an envelope to see what glitchy pitch manipulation I can get. But then I settle on modulating the retrigger time with an LFO set to hold. I only want a small selection of retrigger times, so the depth of this LFO is kept very low. To introduce additional variety, I start to put some release and pitch P-locks into the pattern, and I also revisit the retrigger settings. I maxed the retrigger amount here to see what effect it has, but it does essentially nothing due to the relatively short release time on the amplitude envelope and the relatively long retrigger time. After some filter and compressor tweaks, I decide it's time to add a neighbor track to introduce more timbral variety. I'm focusing on generating noisy and metallic sounds, so a flanger is a sensible choice. I don't want to simply set up the flanger as a static processor. I want to modulate it over time, particularly the delay, feedback, and mix parameters. I decide to experiment with using a triggered exponential LFO as an envelope on the delay parameter of the flanger, which means I need to add triggers into the neighbor track sequence. By using LFOs and P-locks on the neighbor track, while also setting a different length for the neighbor track, I'm able to generate a longer modulation pattern. The internal LFO of the flanger is another modulation source that needs to be carefully considered, and I also set P-locks for the triggered exponential envelope LFO so that we get a variety of flanging effects, some more dramatic than others. It's worth noting that even with the speed of the flanger LFO set to 0, the depth parameter will still have a sonic effect. Following the flanger with another compressor lets me highlight the impact of the flanger and continue to distort the sound. The width parameter of the flanger has an extreme effect on the stereo field. By modulating the ratio of the compressor, I introduce another layer of dynamics variation. Modulating the threshold or ratio parameters of the compressor, reducing the RMS setting will make the dynamic impact more dramatic. Here, I think about starting another set of neighbor track effects, but decide to see what I can do with the remaining LFO. Modulating the speed and depth of the built-in flanger LFO is interesting, but so is adding another layer of modulation to the delay time, so it's hard for me to choose which one I like the most. Now that I've created a very noisy, rhythmic texture with substantial frequency variation, on this next neighbor track, I keep the default filter effect. I also add a dark reverb, so I can manipulate the sensation of space around the sounds I'm generating. I want some hits to generate washes of sound, some hits to generate mild reverb tails, and some hits to be completely free of reverb. On this track, I also control the filter envelope with yet another sequence of triggers at a different pattern length than the previous tracks. I also briefly revisit the source track's filter to see what impact a few tweaks will have on the FX chain I've built so far. Similar to the flanger, I don't want the dark reverb to simply be a static processor, and I'm particularly interested in p-locking and modulating the time and mix parameters. When I go to this filter setup page to try out the filter distortion parameter, you can clearly hear the overall drop in amplitude that happens due to the clipping threshold that's being introduced by the distortion parameter. Now that I have a fairly complex and noisy rhythmic bed, I decide to add a relatively static rhythmic sound. There are several sounds in the sample pack that are either suitable kicks already or are easily shaped into kicks, and with the Octatrack filter and compressor, it's easy to sculpt them. With this new sound in the mix, it's time to revisit and massage my initial signal chain. Not quite vibing with the kick pattern and sound, so I make some quick adjustments. I don't want to spend too much time fiddling with the kick because I want to set up a resampling channel for the original rhythmic texture. Before I set that up though, I want more changes in the level of the initial sound, and an interesting way to accomplish that is with parameter locks on the gain of the secondary compressor. To set up a resampling channel, I set the track to a flex machine and set its sample source to the recording buffer that's associated with that track. I turn off the external inputs as potential sampling sources and set the internal resampling source to be the Q bus. This allows me to more easily control the level of the resampled signal. It also lets me quickly audition different tracks or mixtures of tracks for resampling, but here I simply cue up the second neighbor track of the initial sound I created. I forgot to set a recording trigger on the record sequence page, so nothing had been recorded into the buffer yet. Since the source channel has significant variation and only the beginning of the resample is heard when it's triggered, it creates periodic emergence of a new repeated texture. I do some basic filtering of the resample channel and also adjust the sequence length. It's important to note that the length of the record sequence for a track is always identical to the length of the trigger sequence for that track. In an attempt to increase the separation between the source channel and the resampling channel, I try a chorus for the second effects slot. And I'm still not really vibing with the kick, so I try adjusting the trigger pattern along with the filter and the compressor. The amplitude of the kick signal going into the filter is not extreme, so the internal clipping threshold introduced by the filter distortion parameter does not drop the amplitude of the kick at low distortion values like we heard earlier with our original sound. After some brief tweaks to my resampling channel and initial sound, I decide I want to introduce another rhythmic anchor, and I look for a sample that has some interesting mid or high frequency content. Since I'm not auditioning these samples the way I was earlier, I manually adjust the start position to see if the sample has more variation over time, but since it doesn't have much going on in that respect, I move on to simply sculpting the sample with a filter and compressor to make it fit better with the other aggressive and noisy sounds I'm already working with. I decided that the chorus effect on the resampling channel isn't doing much for me and choose to try a comb filter instead, which gives me the option of deliberately introducing specific pitches. Since I have the comb filter default feedback setting in positive territory, I introduce some parameter locks with negative feedback values to generate shifts in the harmonics produced by the comb filters. By listening carefully to the original rhythmic texture, it allows for more thoughtful decisions on what pitches from the comb filter seem to be the most useful. LFOs on the filter cutoff frequency and the amplitude envelope release time are good targets to produce noticeable variations. I'm revisiting the higher frequency rhythmic anchor, both to make it fit better in the arrangement, as well as for some modulation to make it slightly less repetitive. I also can't help but to continue trying different tweaks to the kick sound. Now looping back to tweaking the initial sound along with its resampling channel. Also try some additional modulation on the resampling channel by modulating the retrigger amount.